Thank you for joining me, Sean Mixon. I'm the Thought Decoder and Reasonable Fate Chapter Director of Dallas. Today I have the plum-pleasing pleasure of being joined by none other than Professor Christopher Wolfe. Dr. Wolfe, it's a pleasure to have you on and to talk about some natural law and the Ukraine and Russia war and how these big ideas apply to these real world situations. But before we jump into those kind of questions, wanted to get a little background about you, Professor Wolfe. I'm pretty sure some of my viewers may not know who you are, and they may want to know who you are. So could you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, sure, Sean. It's great to be here on the Thought Decoder. I've watched several episodes that you've done. I think it's a great show, and I want to encourage you to keep on doing it. I mean, it's been really great to apply, logic and improve our thinking, to especially to help us become better Christians. And I am a Christian. I am a professor at University of St. Thomas in Houston. Got promoted this past summer to associate professor in the political science department here. Yeah. Because I've been here technically 4 years. It's hard to believe because, 2 of those were COVID years. And so we're doing Zoom classes and stuff like that. It's like, did that really even count? But yeah, they did count. So I've made a decent career doing this, and I'm hoping to, maybe share some ideas on how to become a professor, and especially as a Christian, how do you do that with you here today? But in terms of background, I mean, how do we know each other, Sean? It's we were classmates, back at UD, University of Dallas in Irving. I went there for undergrad. I'm from Arkansas originally, but I went there for undergrad and was a philosophy major. And then I went to graduate school in Southern California in political science. And the reason I went into that was because I knew I wanted to study ethics in some kind of way. That was my favorite class that I had as a philosophy major, studying with our mutual teacher, Dr. Simmons, when I was at UD. And so I was like, well, I could study ethics as a political scientist or, in a philosophy department. And so I ended up doing the political philosophy direction. And so I got the PhD at Claremont over the course of actually just like 3 or 4 years out there. And then when I got done with that, I was writing my dissertation back in Arkansas. And it took me about 2 years to write the dissertation after 3 years of coursework. And I spent 1 year in Arkansas living at home with my folks. That was actually a great experience to be back with family. And then, California was kind of crazy, so it was also nice to be back in Arkansas. And then I also, I think it was like, I don't know, I was seeing some friends back at UD that first year I was back after graduate school. And I ended up getting an adjunct job at North Lake College back in Irving, where University of Dallas is. And so for about 4 years, I taught as an adjunct in the Dallas area, taking high school jobs, community college, and in fact, even adjunct job at UD once I finished up my PhD. Now, to become a professor at a community college, all you need is a master's. That's all you have to have. PhD, you'll actually get paid a little bit more, but technically, all you need to do to teach at a community college is a master's. To teach at UD, I noticed that the chair of the department there, he approached me to start teaching at UD once I had finished the PhD. They wanted to have it, because it's university classes, they wanted to have it be high caliber, but that's what I ended up doing. And I, kind of patched together a bunch of teaching jobs until 4 years ago when I got the big job down here, and that's how I ended up here. And one of the things I can advise you all about too is about how to try to publish things. I think that also helped me to get the big job as a professor at St. Thomas in Houston.
Well, I mean that sounds great. But just to take a step back, what? So did you go from the philosophy undergrad to political science graduate school? And so
I
did
did.
you go straight into a PhD program, or did you?
For political science, it's straight into PhD. Now, for philosophy, that would have been a terminal master's first, and then a PhD program after that. I don't. That's the case for almost every philosophy department I know. At least it was back then. But in political science, it was straight to the PhD. But once we finished our coursework, they handed us an MA. Just along the way, and that allowed me to get some teaching experience at those community colleges and at UD.
That's cool. So what was your dissertation over?
My dissertation was on Alistair McIntyre. He's a philosopher of ethics, currently still living, teaches at Notre Dame, and he was a Marxist back in the day, but he eventually found God and also found the classical way of doing ethics and right and wrong, good and bad. And we would call that virtue ethics. And so he wrote a very famous book called After Virtue, explaining his reasons for coming around to that point of view. And so I wrote a dissertation on his view of rights language.
Okay, all right. So, how did that dissertation relate to your current work since then, like post PhD?
Yeah, so I mean that was definitely getting into political theory and ethics, and I've gotten to teach one ethics class where I've been able to bring some McIntyre and other stuff in, and that was honestly one of my favorite classes to teach, but. It's also helped in understanding my field a little bit better, political science and specifically political theory, to study some of the philosophy of rights when I did the dissertation on McIntyre. But in terms of a dissertation, I think it's fun to write on somebody that you're actually interested in and not somebody you hate, that you're just trying to, show this is why he's wrong the whole time. I actually like McIntyre, and it was fun to write, and that helped me get through all that work.
That's you're the first person I've actually heard say that. Everyone else, it seems as if they wrote on someone that they didn't like or something that they were not interested in, and they talk about the grudging work that they
Sometimes you have to do that because your advisors, if you got good advisors, they are looking out for you, saying, oh well, we want you to get a job, and this is what the academic market is looking for. Now, I think it's also a fair question: is the academic market actually interested in good things, important things? Is it really worth playing the game, sort of get the job, to teach something that's really not that important or not worth it? And so at a certain point, I probably was not operating on the play the game side of things. I've definitely gone on the side of try to write about things, publish things that I'm actually interested in order to keep myself going, basically. Even though the stuff I write about is definitely not what most of the people in the field are necessarily interested in.
It's something about that approach that appeals to me, because at least you're a true scholar when you're pursuing your own interests. It seems like the idea of a scholar is not to write about things that interest other people if they're not intrinsically interested in the topics. And I wonder how much depth you can discover and produce if you're not really interested in what if you have just like a casual interest in what you're studying and writing about, or what you're researching. Uh,
Hmm.
with that being said, you did mention that you got landed a big teaching job.
Hmm.
So what does that involve? If a person wanted to become a professor and they look forward to one day having going through that process, what is that process like?
Sure. So everybody's got to apply. There's usually they post it online, or sometimes it's posted in your field. Like for in my field, the big organization is American Political Science Association. In philosophy, I think it's the APA probably, and they'll post these jobs. And so everybody who's a young professor, they're all on the lookout for. Oh, look, they just posted that. So everybody should apply. Also, if you have friends at these places who say, give you a tip and they say, you seem like the kind of guy who should apply for this job, always do that. I mean, so you just got to be on the lookout for that. But then once you do apply, you send in your transcripts of graduate school. You send in your curriculum vitae, which says all the stuff you published, and then you usually send in one or two writing samples, and that can be something you're working on. You can even send in a paper from graduate school. It doesn't have to be published, but you know you send something like that in, and then what'll happen next is it'll probably be about 4 or 5 months, and you won't hear from the place. You'll turn in your application in the fall. You might hear back in January, February, if you end up getting a job. And I mean, I applied, a bunch of places before I was successful, but I had the success in the places where people said you should apply there, and yeah, they were right. And then, so once I did get called in for an interview, the way most people are doing it now, it seems like, is in a hiring committee, we'll take 6 different people and we'll do a short interview on Zoom for about 30 minutes, asking very basic questions about, are they qualified? What's your degree in? Stuff like that. And then we'll narrow it down to about 3 candidates. And then those people will actually be invited to come down to Houston for an interview. Um, and um, once you do that, you basically just have in-person conversations with, you know, the chair of your department, usually the provost of the university. Provost of the university usually is the final say on the hiring after the hiring committee makes their decision. And in my case, I even had to meet with the president of the university. This was an administration which is very hands-on, who actually I think that's a good thing, and they wanted to make sure that I was like actually in tune with the Catholic liberal arts mission of the university. So I think if you're teaching at a smart university, they do care about the mission, and they'll actually look into the people teaching, because it is true, like personnel is policy. Who they're hiring is a big deal in terms of being the professors at universities.
Okay, and so two questions, follow up questions on that. What advice do you have to someone who's starting out into the field of teaching at a college, as far as their CV? If they haven't published a lot, should they try to fill it? How would you go about? What's the approach?
I mean, that's
Uh,
such a difficult thing to get into. It's kind of like getting your first job. You got to have experience to get a job. It's like, but you don't have
right,
any experience yet.
right.
And with publishing, if you can get something published at a journal, you feel confident. It's like, well, maybe I can publish there again. And so my recommendation is um, to on your CV. Um, Include, if you do have some service, in terms of like I served on a committee or something like that, or I volunteered even. But even just any teaching experience is smart to put down there. I mean, I put on down there that I taught high school, and I taught at the community colleges, and that, and just things that you've published. Those are the good things to put on your CV. Um, but we can talk also about how do you get stuff published. That, like I said, that is hard to it's hard to break into that.
Okay. And so, the other question was, follow up question was, I've heard it said that usually when you go to apply for a teaching job at a college or university, that there are hundreds of applicants. Did you
Sure.
know that to be the case
Sure.
in your?
Yeah, I mean, sure, but I mean, like I was on a committee recently. It was like 20 something. So it varies. But a bunch of those people applying, they don't have the right degree even, and so even though a bunch of people are applying, sometimes you might actually have a good chance, even though there's a lot of applicants.
Okay. Okay. Well, that's a hope.
Yeah.
That's hope for us
Yep.
youngsters,
Yes.
as they call them. But so you've published for was it the Harvard Law public law review
Harvard
or public
Journal of
policy?
Law and Public Policy. Yeah, that was on the law review side of things. I hadn't published that kind of article before, and
Wow.
I was interested in wanted to do something like that, and yeah, I got lucky with that one. And publishing a law review is a totally different thing because you know they'll give you a lot of notes and a lot of comments, and they'll actually even look up footnotes for you. It's
Oh wow.
unbelievable. If you get it accepted, I mean, they have what at law schools it's called a law. The students, if they're bright students, they get put on the law journal board, and so they do like the editing and add footnotes literally for articles that have been accepted to the journal. And
Wow.
so that was actually once I got it accepted, it was extremely easy to, finish it up. So that's not the case with most academic peer-reviewed journals you send stuff into. It's like that was an interesting one.
Right. I know when I read the name Harvard, I was just like, I didn't get to the rest of the stuff. Just like Harvard. Wow.
Yeah,
that's
yeah, that
that's
was
awesome.
cool. That was cool.
And so do I understand you to be saying that you've published in like different fields?
Yeah. I study. I've published one in the Review of Metaphysics, which is a philosophy journal. I've got some friends who are political theorists who run one called Perspectives on Political Science, so kind of my own field, and I've been publishing more in that one lately. But yeah, I have published in different disciplines, just because I felt like some of the articles I was writing made more sense as a law article or as a philosophy or as a political science article.
And
And
I bet that looks good on a CV, publishing in different disciplines.
it just shows maybe that I can teach a bunch of different classes, and
Ah.
that I think they a lot of times they are happy to think about on these committees, the hiring committees, like, okay, this guy, we mainly hiring him to teach this one class, but we're also happy that he would be able to be flexible and learn a subject and teach more than just his out McIntyre studies or something like that, something beyond that. And yeah, so I've been kind of flexible to be able to teach like that, even learning things like Texas government, which I didn't know anything about coming from Arkansas, but we got all these like high schoolers in Texas who study Texas, and sometimes they know more than me, but I was able to pick it up.
Yeah, so that's really cool. When I think about writing, uh, it's can be pretty intimidating just by
Hmm.
itself. When I think
Yeah.
about writing, it can be pretty intimidating by itself. But when I think about writing and publishing in academic journals, then it seems like that's like times 10
Hmm.
level of intimidation. So how do you go about like building up the confidence to say, "Hey, I'm going to write something. I'm going to get it published." How do you do that?
I mean, confidence is a big part of it. Um, and that just comes with trying it and failing and not feeling like you're deserved an audience, you know, but uh, but trying it and getting better is really the only way to get better at writing, I think. Um, would you like me to share some steps with you on how to try to improve on writing or on
Yes.
publishing?
So that's
Okay.
when we go to the slide. Oh, I completely, I see it over here. I completely forgot about the slide. Okay, let's go to the slide.
Yeah, I put some slides together here on kind of the way I've tried to build up confidence in publishing something is actually by teaching a class on it first.
That's
Then I
smart.
feel confidence, like I've got teachable knowledge about something. I can defend it. I've defended it with these students at least,
Hmm.
and talked about it with some other people, my ideas about something. Um, and especially if you can teach a full length class on it, I mean that that really helps you with developing an article to try to publish.
Oh,
Um,
that's rich. That is rich there, and I mean, it's as an educator, I know that to be true because we always tell the students, if you can teach it to someone else, another student, then you have to be able to understand it because
that's
you'll
right.
know how to explain it, and if you can explain it, then you understand each all of the components of the ideas, how they go together, and the arguments for each, and so but just actually using that for yourself as a method to increasing confidence in publishing, that's really smart.
hmm I mean, kids, they say, can really see through, somebody's faking it, and uh, that's true with developing our thinking about and trying to, you know, say something in writing too. I think, yeah, being in person is really, in definitive in a class is really good. And so sometimes when I've been teaching classes, I'll also write up a little, Facebook comment about something that came up in class that was interesting, um, or I'll do a blog post. I'm part of a blog called Postmodern Conservative, um, and it's some friends who are also political theorists. And I've been doing that blog I mean, ever since I was back in Arkansas writing the dissertation. I mean, I was kind of cut off from a lot of my academic friends, but I would, participate in that blog. And so writing up a blog post, it's not fully publishing something. It's not like, um, this is like a published article. You don't have to pay anything to do a blog post. You don't have to invest anything. It's just, a post, and so that's once you get an idea, jotting out something on there or just jotting it out on paper and saving a little slip of paper. I sometimes do that too. Um,
Is
that's a
that
way to get
to
started.
is that a place where you're able to maybe collect your ideas and to kind of put them out in a place where you can go back and visit them later if you
Yeah,
put them on and you can just kind of look at it and it can help you to kind of articulate your thoughts.
I think
uh
that's the main reason. I think that's the main reason to do it. I mean, not so much the comments. I mean, every once in a while you get comments, but I mean, sometimes you get goofballs on there. Sometimes you actually
Trolls.
really really sharp people giving you comments, but it's
Mm-hmm.
not. You might probably not getting the real comments. You're right. It's exactly right to collect your thoughts and uh, put it out at least on a blog post or on a Facebook post, and if it seems uh, like it is making sense or not, that's a good place to start. Um,
Hmm.
then we have next thing I would suggest is to um, do oh, Sean, I think this is actually maybe the old slides. Number three, I would suggest is to try to do a conference paper. Um, the conference paper, that's it. Yeah, do a conference paper. Um, and at a conference, you will get those more substantive comments from
Hmm.
some scholars in your field. Um, and sometimes you do a conference paper and there's not anybody in the crowd. Sometimes there is a crowd. There's a really awesome discussion. You get really energized from having a discussion. Or if you get invited to give a talk somewhere, take all those opportunities to give talks, because um, if it's not you, it's going to be somebody else. Um,
Right.
and and also it's just a great place to try out your ideas also. Um, but in a conference paper, it's a good way to do it. And that's a little bit more elaborate than just a blog post or a Facebook post.
Okay. So a conference paper that would probably be the culmination of your research. You probably taught a class. You probably wrote blog posts about it. Now
Mm.
you're developing a paper. Would that be
Yes.
something? Two questions on that. Would that be something you can do before publishing in an article, or in a journal? And secondly, when you are getting feedback, is the feedback more related to your defense of your thesis? Because I could see how those things would both benefit.
Yeah, it is more the defense of your basic thesis. You'll get into the nuance when you send it to a journal. Uh, but the defense of your basic thesis is usually what comes up at those conference discussions. And, um, because you got somebody in the audience or on the panel with you, they might not have much connection to your topic at all, but they'll want to say something to you about your basic point. Um, Now, to the first question, Sean, about um, um, actually, I forgot the first question.
Can you? So once you do this conference paper, with that paper itself, could you use this conference as a step prior to publishing, or
100%. I mean, you might not edit it almost at all, but you do it at a conference first, and the conference gives you a deadline. It's like I've got to appear in person and give this, and when you present it, you're not going to be just reading off the paper usually. Some conferences do that, but a good conference presentation, you should be skipping chunks of your paper usually, because it's usually about a 20 in a lot, like the standard like academic article is not 5 pages. There's only like maybe that's a logic journal for philosophy, but standard academic article, it's about 20 pages double spaced, exactly like you used to do for a graduate school paper. And so you're going to skip. You can't. You give it 15 minutes. You can't read off 20 pages of text. So you're going to be summarizing and giving your main point anyway. And so at a conference presentation, you might worry like, oh, should I do this first? Maybe I should try to send it into a journal first. I don't think so. Most academics I know, they do a presentation first and then they send it into a journal. Um,
okay? Because I'm thinking like businesses, how when they try a product, how they want to
mhm.
try it with customers first before they release it. Is it kind of sort of like the same idea?
Exactly right. Or software, you try out the,
Yeah.
the demo version. It's the
Hmm.
demo version basically.
Okay.
And don't worry, I used to worry like, well, if I do this, will like somebody else like just like publish my same article I just gave at the presentation? It's like, no, I've never had that happen. And I've never known that, that's like, that would be a very rare and, I mean, really questionable thing for an academic to do, to rip off somebody else, especially if you gave it at a conference. I mean,
Mm.
other
Yeah, that's
people could
evidence.
confirm, like he said that at that conference before that guy said it.
Hmm.
Um, and so don't worry about that. I would say do a conference paper first, and then usually though, you've almost finished it up, got it to the point where you can send it into a journal. And you are supposed to just send it into one journal, academic journal at a time. And really, it's a good idea to try to target it, to try to get it to one that fits your topic, and also publishes similar articles. So the choice of which journal to send it to, that can be crucial. And then you just got to wait, basically. And it's a real pain to do that, to wait after you've done all that work. But you just wait. Sometimes you get rejected. Sometimes, if it's an outright rejection, then you just send it to another journal. If it's a revise and rewrite, well, then you actually are almost, you're pretty close to getting published. They call it revise and rewrite. So you send in a second draft, fixing the problems that they said were in the paper. And it might seem brutal, the comments you get back, but that is the job of those editors of peer-reviewed articles. It's anonymous who they're giving comments to, and their job is to try to rip up any part of your paper that they can and be as critical as possible. That is their job. And so you don't have to feel bad or lose confidence. That's what they're trying to do. And if you've gotten revise and rewrite, you actually have done a good enough job that they're giving you a second chance.
Okay. I've had my first rejection. One of my comments was I needed to link more YouTube videos or something into the paper, and they were telling me, they were asking me about what Bill Craig actually, what more he had said about this topic about what did I write on the conceptual background for the logos. And my point for writing that paper is that Bill Craig hadn't delved into the history at all. So this person kind of completely missed the point.
Sometimes they totally miss the point. That's right. And sometimes they want you to write an article on something you don't care about and that you didn't write about. And that's another one where you just say, okay, thank you. You take your ball and go home, and you try to send it to somewhere else. Yeah.
Right. And the more I thought about it, I noticed that I kind of have an interdisciplinary approach, because I was kind of delving into like the history of ideas, which was more historically oriented than just arguing for a particular theory, a philosophical theory. But upon reflection, I'm like, I need to change that. I need to write something that's specifically philosophical. And I guess that goes with point 4. Like, you have to know what type of articles they published.
Yes. I mean, yeah, Sean, I know what your style of arguing. I mean, it's incredibly logical premises and conclusions, and that's the good way to think. But sometimes the way to write and communicate, you might have to tell about like the scholarly development of this thing. It's like, does that really matter for the truth of what we're trying to figure out here? No, but the scholars want to see that sometimes at certain journals. Yeah.
Right. And I think that's just an art itself. Like, you spend so much time studying and critiquing arguments, and then now when you have to actually start writing, it's a whole new skill set. Like, because I can give you an argument in seconds, but I think
the reason that they want to have people include that stuff, the scholarly footnotes and all that, is so that other people can like hook into your argument. It's like, okay, I've read that article by that other guy. I see how that comes in play now. I see,
So it's a way of providing the context of a continuing discussion. Thanks for joining Sean Mixon, the Thought Decoder. We're joined by Professor Chris Wolfe out at St. Thomas Catholic University in Houston, Texas, where it's a Plum, pleasing pleasure to have you back with us. Last time our interview was cut short, so if you're watching this online, it's actually the second part. I just put on the same jacket, and this is why Professor Wolfe has on a different a different outfit. He
That's
didn't,
on the old shirt. Yeah, sorry
you
about
know,
that.
it wasn't a magic trick, but this is a different day, and we're continuing a conversation that we had. Just want to jump straight into it. Last time we talked about, we gave advice. So if you know anyone who aspires to become a professor, Dr. Wolfe gave some advice about how to get published, which is a very important piece of separating yourself from the competition. Although not many people pursue graduate degrees in universities, those who do become a part of the competition. And the way to separate yourself, Dr. Wolfe could attest, is to write. What are you producing? So now we're taking a turn to the next slide, and this is about natural law. Natural law and its census. And I'll just turn it over to Dr. Wolfe. Dr. Wolfe, so what is natural law and its census?
Yeah, well, Sean, I'm glad you asked me to talk about this topic. It's definitely been something that I've been fascinated by in as a teacher of political philosophy, as somebody who was also just a philosophy major back at UD, studying ethics. This is a special topic for that was developed a lot by Catholic and Christian authors in that field of ethics. And so, natural law, I would say it's basically the moral law. It's natural law is the moral law. That's a strict definition that Aquinas gives. Is it's man's participation in God's eternal law. So it's a it's a moral law that reason discovers. It's not something that like a law that we create, like Congress could write a law. Congress can't write the natural law. In the Bible, Paul talks about a law written on men's hearts, even on the Gentiles' hearts, and that they seem to understand something about morality too.
Mm-hmm.
And where does that come from? It comes from God in the way that He made us, and that reason can figure out some things about morality. And so I got really interested in this topic as somebody in graduate school. Because at Claremont, where I went, Claremont, its specialization was in the American founding and actually the Abraham Lincoln. And if you know anything about Abraham Lincoln, the special thing he always focused on and was so interested in was natural rights and the Declaration of Independence and the idea that all men are created equal. That's, I mean, not all American politicians talk about that all the time, but Lincoln, that's kind of like the key to everything for him. And so the Declaration and those ideas of natural rights and that aspect of morality and natural law, to me, that's the most fascinating part of American politics and the times it's come up in our history. It's just the most interesting part of it to me. I mean, a lot of other things are interesting in terms of our, type of government we choose, democracy, and all the things that have happened over the years. But when natural law pops up, that's always, or natural rights or the Declaration of Independence, that's always been the coolest and most interesting parts to me. And you see it going back to the American founding, them having talking about it. You see it with Abraham Lincoln and the Civil War and the arguments for emancipation. And then you see it again with Martin Luther King talking about natural rights. And at his speech in Washington, he talks about the check that was written at the time of the Declaration, but it's come back insufficient funds.
Mm-hmm.
That an aspiration to meet this moral, to meet this moral standard. So that's my interest in the natural law, because we had a Lincoln scholar out there, Harry Jaffa in Claremont, kind of got me onto this. He was still living back then. And then I found out that there were different senses to this term natural law, though. I've given just a very broad kind of common sense usage, the way I've been talking about it now. But some people have a much more specialized technical usage. Some people are only talking about the way Aquinas talks about it. Some people, there's actually lawyers today, when they talk about natural law, they mean something slightly different than the way I was using the term earlier. Lawyers will contrast natural law with positivism, whereas I don't think there really is the contrast like that in that broader sense of what the way I've been talking about it. But for lawyers, it's either you're a positivist or you're a natural law thinker. And so what they're talking about there, it's a theory of obligation for following the law, which says that legislators, when they are just, create laws which discover and express moral reasons which ought to be obeyed. So that's natural law. Contrast that with positivism, which says there are no moral reasons. Lawmakers are simply positing commands and compel people by punishments and rewards. So a lot of times that's a utilitarian approach to jurisprudence. Say, okay, you'll be fined $100 if you do that. It's not so much that, oh, this is we're fining you because there's a moral duty not to do that. So it can be used in much more technical sense as natural law, but it is this broad-based way of reasoning, and there's some specifics to it that a lot of people don't know about that have been developed, and I would like to share some of those with you. So can we go to the next slide, maybe?
Just to follow up on this slide, because I did have some questions on that.
Yeah.
So first, and if this is in your next slide, you just let me know.
Sure.
First, what does the word law entail?
Mm-hmm.
So what does that entail, that idea that there's a natural law or a moral law? What are some other connected ideas with law?
Necessity.
Okay.
And bindingness. That's all law, or the word use in Latin means, is there's a bind on something. That's what a law
is. It like obligation?
Obligation
duty?
can be one kind of necessity, and it can be one moral obligation. I mean, obligation can be one kind of binding. So I would say yes, obligation is synonymous, I think, with law. Yeah.
Huh. So if you break the law, you don't fulfill your obligation.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And then in the Declaration of Independence, it says that all men are created by their all men are given certain inalienable rights and are endowed by their Creator with these rights, and they are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. What is the relationship between a right and a law?
Right. Well, yeah. So they don't. It doesn't use the word law in the Declaration. That's a good point. They use the language of natural rights. And from my perspective, both rights and duties are parasitical on a notion of the good, of what is actually good for human beings. And if we say something is a natural right, we're actually making a claim about human nature, saying this is something that's actually good, that, if you're deprived this right, you're doing something morally wrong, according to nature. Just according to nature.
That's interesting, because I was thinking, would another way of a framework be intrinsic value of a human person?
Yes.
Because I see. So what you just said is, I didn't expect you to go that way, because you said, well, there are these goods, and these goods are the good. They're good within themselves, right? It's not good by virtue of something else. It's an inherent, intrinsic good. So what's the focus here is there are these goods, and you have a duty to maintain these goods, and not to destroy them. Or I've heard the approach. So I wonder if these are different, like, theories of the same thing. But I've often heard that, human beings have intrinsic moral worth or dignity.
Yeah.
And so this is why, since they have dignity, maybe but I don't know how the story goes from there to connect to life, liberty, and
Yeah. Maybe one thing
so
that
I think your theory works.
maybe, yeah, thank you. But maybe one thing that might be helpful is to think about what work does equality do in the whole scheme of thinking about rights. And if we look back at one of the influences on John Locke, there was a Thomas Aquinas natural law inspired bishop, Anglican bishop, named Richard Hooker. Richard Hooker. A lot of people think that John Locke was really totally inspired by Hobbes. But if you read John Locke, Locke says, no, I'm quoting from the Venerable Hooker. And actually, C.S. Lewis, in several of his writings, I think maybe definitely The Abolition of Man, but also in a few other books that C.S. Lewis writes, he says he's a big fan of hookers. Not he's a big fan of hookers, but Richard Hooker. But anyway, what Richard Hooker, the role of equality in Richard Hooker's discussion is, he says, equality is important because that's what makes rights and duties correlative. That Hobbes would say you have rights, but there's no correlative duties. You might have a right to fight for yourself or preserve your own life, but you have no duty to preserve anyone else's life. It's totally egoistic. So equality, actually, in Richard Hooker and I think in Locke, and it serves that important role of making rights and duties correlative. But at the end of the day, they're parasitical on the notion of the good, the notion of human nature. Both those words, rights and duties.
Right.
And equality, as we talk about in the Declaration, also has another work that it does. We're talking about all men are created equal. There's more there in terms of natural, talking about if someone is a natural ruler or not. It would say no, that we're all created equal. There's a famous letter from Jefferson where he says, they say, well, what did you mean by that? And he says, he has a couple of letters where he spills the beans on some of these things, but in one of them to Roger Waitman, letter to Roger Waitman at the end of his life, he says, he has this thing that other founders said also, that no man was born with boots and spurs on his feet, and no man was born with a saddle on his back.
Wow,
right?
That's powerful.
Yeah, no man.
Oh,
and
wow.
so neither one.
Wow. So, okay, this is very helpful because I'm glad I asked this question because it seems like there are a lot more ideals here than I was aware of. So now I'm thinking something you said, that these rights and duties are parasitic on the human nature and the nature of the good. That puts me in mind of Aristotle. How when Aristotle was discussing health, and he was saying, what's good for A may not be good for B. The ideal, I think he was talking about the telos, the highest good of a thing. Do you think maybe that's related? Like the highest good of a human is for him to be free, to be alive, and with life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Is it any historical evidence or
So
that these are?
I might be. I just think that the the discussion of the Declaration and this discussion of natural rights. I'm just saying it's traditional ethics and it's rooted in the good that way. And so maybe I might be reading Aristotle a little bit too much into it, but I would stick with that though, that it's a traditional kind of ethics that's these rights are rooted in the good, as opposed to other kinds of discussions of rights. Some discussions of rights do not root things in a human nature. So when they put the word natural in front of rights, significant. I do think that's significant. And I also think the phrase unalienable is also significant. But when people talk about rights now, they might be talking about group rights. And that can be conventional. I can be part of that group and then I get those rights. It could be totally conventional. But these things are not conventional, they're natural. And we're talking about the human nature and what's naturally good and naturally wrong. And they're making claims about, so those are kind of Aristotelian kinds of claims. I mean, in terms of evidence for that, Jefferson has another letter where he talks about what were my influences. He says, well, really, this was just an expression of the American mind. All American Whigs thought alike on these subjects. And I neither copied it from one source, nor was this a completely original document that I wrote.
Oh, wow, that's fascinating.
But he says some of the things that I did, some of the things that did affect me personally, he says that were authors like Locke and Philip Sidney, Cicero, and Aristotle. He says.
That's a huge connection.
Letter to Henry Lee. Henry Lee is the guy who wrote that too.
And I guess so. So my next question was about the implications of positivism. If there are no moral reasons, then it seems like you cannot. There are no. I mean, what would it mean for there to be just or unjust laws?
I know.
They don't. Yeah. There are no unjust laws. It's just there are just laws, right?
Yeah, it's more efficient, operating of things. You want to set things up to be efficient, maybe to maximize the preferences of people, but it's not like those preferences are morally right and wrong. When you take this to, I think, its logical conclusion. Yeah.
Right. Wow, that's pretty scary. Do we know who these positivists are?
Yeah. I mean, but that's I just brought that up because that's it's a little bit more narrow and technical way of talking about natural law, but it's also a usage of it that you hear.
Right. It reminds me of Nietzsche, the will to power. Might makes right.
Read. The one to read about this is for the classic positivist rejection of natural law by one of these lawyers is a justice, Oliver Wendell Holmes.
What?
Oliver Wendell Holmes wrote an article in Harvard Law Review called "On the Natural Law," where he utterly rejects it, and he gives his reasons.
What?
There, yeah.
He's an American hero, isn't he?
I know. I mean, although he was a hero to liberals, Oliver Wendell Holmes, because he comes up with some of the initial arguments for free speech, and they're excellent arguments. The phrase "free marketplace of ideas" comes from him. It's not from Mill, John Stuart Mill. It's actually from Holmes. And And so, but at the end of the day, he's a social Darwinist. He has strong Darwinian thinking, and I mean, so that this is why he rejects kind of traditional morality. Oliver Wendell Holmes did.
He's a
He's
social
fascinating
Darwinist. That is crazy.
Yeah.
Wow.
He's famous for this. So he's famous for this one decision called Buck versus Bell, where that was mandatory sterilization case, and he said that's that's allowed. Yeah, he said that's allowed, and he says 3 generations of idiots is enough. Is his phrase? He's a social Darwinist. He doesn't want.
Wow. I've actually did some study over this summer about the influence of Darwinian ideas on not just the euthanasia and the movement here in America from Planned Parenthood and just the background of ideas where they were trying to create the perfect, species.
Eugenics was popular. It was popular until World War II, and we saw, Nazis are doing eugenics.
Right.
So we were able to see the syllogism finally. Nazis bad. Eugenics practicing. Nazis practicing eugenics. Oh, eugenics bad. Americans finally realized it after that.
Right.
But that's right.
And during the same time, they had an African boy, and they took him from Africa, put him in New York, and one of the exhibits, like the fairs that they would have, and had him on display, and said, "Meet the half boy, half human, half ape," and the black preachers in New York, as well as a white Baptist preacher, they were the only ones speaking out against this and trying to get this boy free. So the boy finally was able, through a legal decision, was able to be released, and he went to live in an orphanage. And later on, he took his life. He killed himself. He was traumatized from. They would let him out, and they said they would let him out of the cage, and people all around the park would just chase him, like all day, chase him around. And so that's the. I mean, it's the natural. If random genetic variation, when given a certain amount of time, delivers new body types and body plans and species, then you can say, okay, well, who was the closest? If we evolved from apes and we had a common ancestor that chimpanzees and human beings evolved from, well, you can say, well, what race is closest to the apes? And since the bones were found in Africa of older species, it was just it's a simple logical step to say, okay, well, that means that if you have a race that is closest to the chimpanzee and Homo sapien ancestor or Homo ancestor, then you should have a race that is further away, and then that now you have a class of the races, one who is more evolved than the others.
And that was a respectable opinion in America, and it's really sickening. There's just a few dissenters in that case, in the Buck v. Bell case I mentioned about forcible sterilization, and one of them was Justice Murphy, and they think that he dissented because he was Catholic, and they were saying that this is not. They thought it was because it was his personal moral views, perhaps. But I wouldn't just make an argument against it just based on personal moral views. I mean, I think I can make a pretty good constitutional argument against it too. We're talking about liberty and things like that, But
right.
It's right. I mean, yeah. So just because an argument, just because a opinion is respected, doesn't mean it's true
or moral. And it seems like this positivism idea seeks to separate morality from law.
It does.
And what's being codified through law is just sheer will of
Yes.
individuals, and then they can use the same law to control others through punishment and reward. So that's, to me, that's tyranny.
Yeah. That's right. That's right. Back to the old arguments about tyranny. Back to Aristotle. Back to Plato. Back to Socrates.
So I'll and I think that was it that I had on that. We can go to the next.
That's
So this is very, as you can see, I got a lot from it. It was
Yeah, so I just point out in the next slide that, there's been many different versions of natural law over the years. It's not just a Catholic theory. You do see it, for example, in actually something like it in Taoism. Discussion about a permanent moral reasons about human nature. C.S. Lewis talks about it in there. And then it predates Christianity as well. You see Cicero, his discussion of it in De Officiis, and so. But I would say, as a big influence, its heyday was during the late Middle Ages, early modern period. You see the most discussions of natural law. We still have some of these influences today, but if you look at some discussions of rights and laws and duties, and for example, in the UN Charter, even the UN Charter was maybe a little bit natural law inspired, but over time they've added more and more rights, and some of them just really aren't connected with the natural law arguments anymore. But so there's been many different theories as well as senses of this term, natural law. Probably ready to go on the next one, I think.
just do we know? Okay, let me work backwards. Cicero. So although they may have held to a natural law, what do we know? What their basis? What was it grounded in?
Cicero's was a combination of Stoic and Aristotelian ideas. And so he talked about the cardinal virtues in De Officiis. And he said that the natural law is connected with justice, the virtue of justice. And so he would say that, it's a standard for society that you ought to respect out of justice. And so by acting justly, that's actually part of your good, your virtue, will be in respecting the natural law. And so that's the way that Cicero talks about it in De Officiis. It's a beautiful combination of the cardinal virtues and natural law and Aristotelian eudaimonism, focusing on happiness in the telos of the human good, the flourishing life. Combines both in Cicero. And I think you see the same thing in Aquinas to a degree as well.
Okay, because the reason I asked that is because Aristotle is notable or noted in the politics, in his politics, for saying that there are natural slaves and slaves, and that you shouldn't hold someone who is not a natural slave in slavery, and that they're a natural slave if their body is fit for their purpose, and that's the best that they can do. I guess so he was saying something about their intelligence, and he was like, those who, it's just a quote that says from his politics 1254b 16 through 21, says, those who are different from other men as the soul from the body or man from beast, and they are in this state if their work is the use of the body, and if this is the best that can come from them, are slaves by nature. So as different from men as man from beast or soul from body. So the man from beast seems to be, he's pointing to a type of intellectual elitism, and saying that basically what it means to be, I guess it goes back to what I was saying about telos. Like, this is the highest good, so this is the highest. If someone hasn't reached this level of rationality, then it's natural for them to be a slave. So I was saying what I was wondering what would Cicero would ground this in, because they weren't like. I think Christianity seems to be unique in not just this belief that there are certain things that people find right and wrong, but grounding it in the image of God in man, because in the Old Testament, the Jews were told to. So I see a lot of apologists giving a response to the claim that the Old Testament God was evil, and they say, well, there's slavery in the Old Testament. The Bible doesn't condemn slavery. It's not condemned, and so I've heard a lot of apologists say things like, well, it's not condemned, but the Bible does have a different perspective on slavery, because after the 7th year, you have to let your slave go. Yeah. But once you read it, it actually says that they have to let the Hebrew slave go. Then
no usury against your fellow Hebrews.
Right. And then it says of the foreigner and the stranger, it says you can own him perpetually.
Right. Yeah, I read a good book about Old Testament morality and challenging things for us reading it today. It's called "Is God a Moral Monster?"
Right, Paul.
The answer is no.
Paul.
Paul.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, and so his main point is that, well, if you compare Israel with the other Near Eastern cultures, like the Babylonians and the Syrians and the other ones around them, God took them from something terrible before and took them very far, maybe not exactly where we would have the laws, but much better than those other, what it was coming out of, and so it's, there's only so much God's going to do given the hardness of people's hearts and their culture. He's not going to necessarily force people to do things.
Right.
He took he revealed a lot with his 10 Commandments, and revealed a lot with the laws. So that's kind of my perspective on the Old Testament. But I take your point though about slavery, even in the New Testament. There's the runaway slave, Philemon, and I mean, Paul doesn't say, okay, you're just in breaking away. Go ahead and
right.
He says, he tells the slave master, treat him right.
As a brother. And he's like, if you love me, then this is my heart I'm sending back to you. And but a clear difference between the old and the new is that in some sense this variation of human worth dependent on social status, Paul destroys it. Yes. He says, for in Christ there is no longer a slave nor a master, a Jew nor a Gentile. So it's because Paul saw Christ as uniting all things. And I think this is what he says. I was just reading. I think does he say that in Ephesians? I think the last book I was studying, he said, I think it was Ephesians, but he said Christ unites all things in himself. And so that the solution to inclusivity, as we hear discussed today, is Christ is at the center of this. But he doesn't destroy. It's a unity, and not uniformity.
Yes.
We are grafted in, but we're not the same thing. It's a harmony. But so I think this Christian influence, in many ways, it's like the new covenant supersedes the old, and it fulfills it, and it takes it further. And Jesus came, and he was like, "You've heard this, but I'm telling you this." It's like God had been waiting to come to earth. Can we divorce our wife, Jesus? He said, well, Moses allowed you to divorce your wife because of the hardness of your heart.
Yes.
And that's interesting. He said that Moses allowed this, and that as if there was an authority that Moses had as the leader of the people to give them laws. I mean, which that's not controversial. Most leaders, who govern a people, they are in charge of governance.
Right. And we have the render unto Caesar. I mean, Jesus doesn't say, well, overthrow Caesar,
Right.
Actually pay the taxes. So it's not, Christianity isn't a demand that you've got to have democracy everywhere right now.
Mm-hmm.
Didn't say that. As you said, unity. Maybe you do have a monarchy somewhere, and maybe we do have democracy over here, but we can still be unified in being Christians. And
Right.
That's right.
So I think the Christian basis, the Christian theory gives some ground to this moral law that many of us have observed in different cultures, an eye for an eye and tooth for a tooth. Like there's a equality,
Yeah.
And so this.
Yes, and I think that maybe that is beyond Aristotelianism. That is, and that is something that Christianity adds. I think you're right. When we're talking about the created equal part, well, how do you have a created equal with no creator? I do think that's actually theological. That aspect of equality is theologically inspired. I agree, and I didn't mention that before. I was mainly talking about the equality of rights and duties with nature, but the created equal part, that might be straight biblical.
Right. And endowed by their creator.
Yeah.
The image of God. It's something with certain rights that that are given, that transcend society.
And that actually connects with the next slide, is to say natural law.
Huh.
I think could you be an atheist and believe in natural law? Well, it always begs the question, well, who is the lawgiver for this natural law? And so I think that atheists could believe in natural law in terms of there being a moral law that reason could discover. But natural law, it almost begs a question always. And it did for Cicero. I mean, Cicero made the connection with the divine and in natural law.
Who did he attribute it to? Zeus or?
Yeah, no. I mean, it's a very philosophical kind of god for him. But the planets he talks a lot about. He's mainly looking up. But for Aquinas, so he says one interesting thing about natural law is he divides law into four parts. Aquinas does, and he says there's a natural law, human law, divine law, and eternal. Now, the last two, divine law and eternal, you might say, what's the difference between those two? Divine law is the kind of thing where God commands something in the Old Testament. It's revelation. That's God's revealed law. Now, eternal law is God's providence. And so that's the way, also just the way God designed the universe. God's providence designed insects a certain way. God's providence designed gravity and the laws of physics and rocks and matter and everything a certain way. God's providence made it that way. And he also made us a certain way. And so that's why Aquinas says natural law is man's participation in the eternal law. It doesn't say natural law is man's participation in or divine law. It's derived from the eternal law, or a reflection of the eternal law. The particular part of the eternal law that applies to our morality, our good. And so, and then
that part there almost looks like divine command theory. This notion that as a response to the Euthyphro, I believe that was Robert Adams, said that the Euthyphro dilemma is, for those watching who've probably never heard of it, the Greek pantheon was included many gods. So if they all had different, and I was just reading Hesiod, and I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly, but I'm doing a study on like the Greek understanding of creation to prepare for my PhD proposal. But I want to see like how did they think things were created. But Hesiod says that the gods actually created evil.
Yes.
Like that's a part of the story. Like,
they have done that. Yeah.
Like so their gods are responsible for evil. Mm-hmm. So what makes something good, since it's so many of them? Is it the fact that they want it? That's why it's good? Whatever they want is good, or is it good? Or do they want it because it's good? Is good something independent? And so what Robert Adams said is that God is good, which is something that David said in the Psalms. He says God is good. And since God is identical with the good, whatever he expresses is also good. And he expresses to human beings edicts through Scripture, and this becomes our moral prerogative for us to obey his commands. And that seems like that's what's going on here when I see the eternal law and moves through to the divine law. And so, but the natural law, I don't have a reference for this.
Sure. Well, so one interesting thing is, where does Aquinas place the Ten Commandments, for example? And where does he place other parts of the old law, like, the culinary requirements of the old law? Now, the culinary requirements, we would say that was divine command. But Aquinas says that, I want to say 9 out of 10 of the 10 commandments, he thinks are both divine command and natural law. They're both divine law and natural law. 9 out of 10 of the 10 commandments. And you might say, what about like keep holy the Sabbath day? That's part of natural law. Well, that's the one that, you can make some kind of moral argument about human beings need a rest, or things like that. But actually the one about, there being one God and you will have no other gods before me, Aquinas actually thinks that natural reason can come to that. And so he doesn't say that's just divine command. But, thou shalt not kill, obviously also against natural law. It denies someone their right to life, natural right to life, And so there's overlap in the 10 commandments of natural law reasons and divine command, divine law reasons.
Okay, so I see another connection here now. So it looks like, because I've never made this connection until just now, but we talk about natural theology,
right?
Which natural law seems to be it as it apprehends. So the reflection of eternal law in the created, it's the reflection of and not the reflection on eternal law. So it's what reflects from the eternal law in the mind of created, in the created rational mind, as it apprehends the structure of creation. So it's like the image of God in man, and this knowledge, maybe like Paul said, that the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all people who hold the knowledge of God in unrighteousness. For the invisible things of God are clearly seen. So he has this both this part where something internal to us, as we interact with creation, speaks of God.
Yes.
And
that's
so
the promulgation of it. That's the that's what we for something to be a law for Aquinas. It has to meet 4 requirements, and I didn't put this in any slide.
Okay.
But the 4 requirements are that it must be made by a legitimate authority. It must be an ordinance of reason for the common good, and it must be promulgated. Well, how is the natural law promulgated to human beings? I mean, we can see what. Yeah, so it's through the conscience. That's the promulgation. So, I mean, we have a promulgation of other laws, like it's posted that you can only drive 50 miles per hour in this neighborhood. That's a civil human law saying only drive 50 miles per hour.
Oh, that's good.
That's promulgation. If you didn't know what the speed limit was, well, then that law wasn't promulgated very well. Well, so how do we get the natural? I mean, and so when we got the divine law, how is that promulgated with the 10 Commandments? Well, we got those 10 Commandments,
Right, through Moses.
Through Moses. I mean, and so how did the natural law get promulgated, though? Written on our hearts through the conscience. And so actually, that's the next. I have some of that written up. On the next slide.
But law of nature is at the bottom, and I see human law as well. And then it's an analogy that's very helpful, because I think historically science has been based on this analogy. The clockmaker, and Mother Nature, and things of this sort, and law of sin.
I got this from Bujashevsky, by the way. J. I didn't come up with that.
I can't spell that.
Philosophy professor at UT.
Okay.
Bujashevsky.
Slaughter that. Try to type that.
It's actually the next slide.
Okay.
Here we go. Sean, I post in the chat.
Okay.
A couple points here. Aquinas believed human beings learn the natural law through practical reasoning informing their conscience. The first principle of practical reasoning is that we tend to choose what we think is good and not choose what we think is bad. We may be right or wrong about what is good for us. We might have a malformed conscience, as they say, but we choose under the guise of the good. These repeated habitual choices of good and bad are what form our conscience for Aquinas. So it's a kind of habit, is the way that the conscience, that thing God put in us, is what helps promulgate these views of justice to us. And it might take some discovery. And then the second point, there's been kind of 3 classic first principles that Aquinas and Cicero and all the mainstream natural law thinkers over the years have talked about. They say you can usually figure these out by reason, that a natural law duty to preserve life, or a natural right to life. You can see that that's part of the natural law.
What about the Hippocratic Oath?
Yeah,
isn't that related?
He would say it's built into something like the Hippocratic Oath. Yes,
to preserve life.
Do no harm. Right. there's also a natural law duty in terms of procreation and education of children. And that's interesting and surprising for a Catholic priest to be talking about the procreation of children being a natural right. But he's honest enough to acknowledge it, even though
Could you explain that? Because
he's
I'm
not,
not
he's not,
grasping the.
he's not going to be having children as a priest in the Catholic Church.
Oh,
They are celibate. Um,
oh,
so,
so
but
to admit,
that's a sacrifice. It
mm,
wouldn't be like as a priest he would say, yeah, that's not good, or that's. And he said, no, that's actually good to have kids, to have a
mm,
wife, but that's actually it's viewed as a sacrifice of a good. Um, then lastly, contemplation of truth, especially the truth about God. So it's kind of a natural right with regard to our reason. Um, and so those are there's some first principles of natural law, very deep principles that you see at work in many of the things that are naturally just. Um, and then there's more particular expressions of these, and they call those the secondary principles. Um, and so, in order to preserve life, you might uh, that first principle, you might have a secondary principle that says drive 50 miles per hour in this area so that you don't kill anybody.
mm.
So that's like a particular secondary. Um,
So these are deductions from the first principles.
right, their deductions are more applications. So actually, it wouldn't say drive 50 miles per hour, but it might be like drive safe or something like that. And then we might create a human law, drive 50. You know, um, So there's um,
So that's the progression from the uh, what was that diagram? From the eternal to the human.
from the eternal to the human, exactly. A
Okay.
determination, particular determinations, the law of nations common to all peoples. That's something I wanted to finally talk about with you, Sean. The law of
United
nations.
Nations.
Well, no, the law of nations. They call this jus gentium,
Huh.
Jusgentium, the law of nations.
Is that
Law.
related to common law theory?
No, no.
Okay.
This is the law of nations is kind of the rules for engagement between countries, between France and
Okay.
Germany, between
Okay.
America, or between Russia and the Ukraine, even.
Okay.
It's between any countries. Because if you think about it, they've each got their own human law. And, what if they pass a human law that says, well, we can invade Ukraine if they're Russia? What if
Mm.
Ukraine says, well, we don't agree with that human law? And we've got our Ukrainian human law that says you can't do that. Well, we can apply reason and these principles of natural law to help us figure out international relations between countries, the jus gentium, the law of nations, in a rational way. And what's the natural law going to say about this? Don't kill innocent people. Respect those natural rights that we talk about in the first principles. And so Suarez, who was a Spanish Thomist in the a couple of hundred years uh, after Aquinas, the Spanish Thomists, they came up with these arguments about international relations. Hugo Grotius was another big writer on this
Oh
from
wow.
the Netherlands. The Netherlands, also natural law inspired, um, and so in that early modern period, this was a big time application of natural law was in international relations theory, jus gentium, and so what they develop, Suarez in particular, is what we call just war theory,
Ah.
and it's derived from natural law. Suarez says that it's almost like a mean between human law and natural law is these discussions about just war theory and law of nations. But the reason they got to talking about it was because of Aquinas' discussions of natural law and other other authors talking about natural law before that.
So where could we find like the principles of natural law? Did Aquinas write about those all of the principles? I know right here we're looking at
Mm-hmm.
some of them.
Summa Theologia, question 91. The first
Okay.
principle thing that I just mentioned,
Are
it's a
you ready
classic
for that one?
article. Yeah. Yeah, it was the most unfair thing ever in graduate school. This is the most. This is like the most assigned article in the Summa Theologia. Is the thing about the first principles. Uh, it's what everybody reads if they read something from Aquinas, not related to the proof of God's existence. That's the other thing everybody will read. But the stuff about ethics and natural law, they'll always go to question 91. And when I had to pass a Latin exam for graduate school, I got Cicero, some of the hardest Latin imaginable.
Oh wow.
My friend got question 91 of the Summa, which he's read 100 times. And so
Mm.
all he had to do was fake like he knew Latin and just write the English.
Mm.
One of the great injustices that happened in graduate school was that right there. Hey, Judge, if you're out there. uh, but, yep.
Yeah.
Now, I've got another slide or two here on uh, on just worth theory, and this being one of the good applications. I mentioned, a couple other applications in terms of bioethics, and you mentioned the Hippocratic Oath. Precisely, um, ideas about natural law and not taking innocent life, and even just having a definition of murder as an intentional taking of an innocent human life. That's actually helpful to have a definition like that when we're talking about all the difficult situations and circumstances that can come up in end of life care, for example, or beginning of life, for example, or someone gets in an accident. What governs some of those circumstances? Having clear principles about that actually is important, and not just having utilitarianism, I think, is important. Because if it's just utilitarianism, we get into arguments about what's the greater good for society, and that becomes very, very dangerous. Just like the discussion we were having earlier about eugenics and things like that.
Who's good
Yeah, who's
and whose
exactly.
interpretation of good?
And
Uh,
if you think about it, speaking of eugenics and the Nazis again, what about the Nuremberg war trials? Those Nazis, they said, when we were killing the Jews, they said, I was just following orders.
mm.
That's the Nazi defense every time. I was just following orders. They told me to kill the Jews. I was obeying the human law. And so ultimately, it's really interesting. The American judges, Bob Jackson, the justice who goes over to Nuremberg to put these guys on trial, says, you should have known better. I don't care that your human law said that. You should have known better. And he makes a natural law argument.
Mm.
Yeah, that there's actually a natural, a higher law that should have told you that. And this is the same thing that Martin Luther King talks about in
Mm-hmm.
the letter from Birmingham jail. How
Mm-hmm.
can you disobey this law and obey this
Mm-hmm.
law? Same thing. And it goes actually maybe the first mention of natural law, even before Cicero, is actually, you can find it talked about in the Greeks. Antigone.
Mm.
There's a play, Antigone, where the ruler of the city says, you're not allowed to bury your brother to Antigone. Creon, the ruler, says that. And Antigone does it. She disobeys the ruler. And they're like, why did you disobey the ruler? She said, well, I was obeying a higher law from the gods. And so that's that kind of higher law. That notion of higher law, that is, when we're getting into that, we're getting into the realm of natural law.
Hmm. And so to go back to bioethics, I believe I remember seeing some of the news in Spain that they had legalized euthanasia, and it
Sure.
says June 25th, 2021, the organic law for the regulation of euthanasia came into force.
Hmm.
Uh, and so basically, if I'm understanding this correct, if a person wants to, if the person is in the meet certain conditions, they're in the hospital care, the care of medical professionals, and they want to end their lives, uh, they can legally.
Not only that, Sean, so that's assisted suicide. Euthanasia is somebody else could decide to put you out of your misery. Not just you put yourself out of your misery, but it could be somebody else. And so that's the way that euthanasia is, yeah, legalized there, also in the Netherlands, also in Canada. And what's going on now with that is when you
That's
have some dangerous,
unconscionable.
some slippery slopes there in terms of um, people putting the people out of their misery, where um, it
So had Dr. Death been,
yeah, oh, Kevorkian would have been totally innocent in these other places. Yeah, I mean,
he,
one
he would have been a hero.
a hero. Yes,
He's just following the law
right,
to the T.
right. But I would suggest to you that they're not really paying attention to natural law principles or or real ethics at all when they're doing that kind of thing. I mean, it's utilitarian.
Mm,
What's going to be the greater good for society
mm,
in their judgment, in their
right.
judgment.
And then let's see.
Oh, blank slide. Ah, okay. So how do we apply just war theory and the natural law discussions to the conflict in Ukraine? I actually asked my students this, and we had a good debate about it. And I even had some people who wanted to play devil's advocate for things like that. Um, but there's some criteria that were created by Suarez and other writers on just war theory, and that typically the criteria tend to fall into two categories. It's called jus in bello, jus ad bellum. Justice in war and how you conduct war, and justice in terms of the causes for war. Was it a just cause for war, and are you conducting it in a just way? Two
Mm,
different issues. Um, and you might say think something is a just war for either reason. They're conducting it like monsters. They're they're just killing innocent people.
mm,
That might be one thing is where you say this is an unjust war. But it also might be an unjust war where we're just invading to take their stuff.
mm,
This is an unjust war. This is our stuff. They're just invading to kill us or something. Well, that would be use in bello. Two different lines of thinking. And so there's a Thomist philosopher, Ed Feser, has a good blog. He had a really good article and also a good blog post about what if we apply the classic criteria of just war theory to the Ukraine conflict, would we say it was an unjust invasion by Russia? Is it a just war? On the other, and on the other perspective, is it a just war for Ukraine to fight them? And in both cases, he says yes.
mm.
Here's the reasons. He says, at one and the same time, the damage inflicted by the aggressor on the nation or community of nations must be lasting, grave, and certain. So Russia upon Ukraine. All of their means of putting an end to it must have been shown to be impractical, and ineffective. There must be serious prospects for success in doing the war, and the use of arms must not produce evils or disorders graver than the evil to be eliminated. So the evil to be eliminated, I guess, in Russia's case was they were worried about NATO encroaching on their destabilizing the situation. Is that evil as grave as the evil of invading and the bombing and the killing in the invasion? The power of modern means of destruction weighs very heavily in evaluating that condition. Think about World War I. And so, yeah, he says, Fazer says, Russia's invasion fails to meet the first, second, and fourth criteria, clearly. And NATO military action against Russia would clearly meet the second, third, and fourth criteria. So there is a question. Notice he didn't include the third one in terms of the prospects for success. And so this is all about the line of reasoning about starting the war, deciding to engage in it. There are also some other questions about proportional means. Do you use a nuclear warhead when the other side is just, attacking with conventional weapons? That would be a disproportionate way of fighting. These kinds of principles do historically come out of the natural law tradition, and I think they're actually quite useful for trying to think about this. And my students, they had a good debate, but they more or less came around to the same kind of opinion that Fazer did here when looking at the criteria. And you might say, are these criteria helpful? They might be, if we're deciding about whether Congress should declare war on a country or we should be involved in something. Colin Powell also has some lessons that he talks about whether we should do an engagement or not. That likelihood of success, we should also consider those too. But just war theory is kind of a cool application, I'd say, of natural law theory.
It's very interesting. I just recall watching William Lane Craig say something about this respond or weigh in, and I recall him saying it may be the right thing to do may be to give up if you are Ukraine, and because of how many people would die if they resisted. And then I'm looking at this, and that third criteria, there must be serious prospects of success, and I'm like, that's
why I think
it makes sense.
That's why Craig would say that, and it's so, and it rubs us so the wrong way to think that.
Yeah, it does.
The bad guys gonna win, if the bad guys win, but almost nobody died, you do need to think about that if it means that almost everybody in your country is going to die. That's the one question mark, and you see that in Fazer's what he wrote here too. But the third criteria, prospect for success, and there's that element is debated among natural law thinkers too. But it doesn't kind of make sense to me if the goal is about the preservation of innocent life.
So he didn't think NATO's military could be successful against Russia. That's interesting.
I mean, it's a real question with this conflict. What's it going to take to get to peace now? And that's always hard to say ahead of time.
I mean, because what we see from the Ukrainians fighting, it seems like they're successful against Russia, and now they've gone on the offense, flying drones right into even Russian territory and taking over or trying to reclaim Crimea.
I think you need another argument if they were going to go into Russia. Then you'd actually need another argument because if you're no longer in just your country,
right. And so, but that's interesting. I'm just speculating as to why he didn't think NATO would be successful. Maybe if Russia responded to NATO with nuclear weapons, maybe that wouldn't.
That's a big worry. Yeah, it's very troubling. The whole thing, very, very troubling.
I was troubled, seriously, day and night. I was watching the news when I heard that Russia was invading. I said, "Oh my goodness, this is terrible." And when I saw, the news reports about millions and millions of Ukrainians leaving for other countries and nations and leaving their homes, and then as I began to watch video of people just walking by a park, and a missile blows up a building. It's incredible. It's incredible. I don't know if I could process it mentally if I was there, to just be in the neighborhood and have rockets come flying through your. I would be like, is this really happening? Or to be at a school when teaching, and bullets come, we just get so accustomed to the peace that's in America, the general peace, so I think this is very helpful. Some questions that I have for the study would be, how much of this just war theory, again, it seems like Aristotle's always some lurking behind his rhetoric. In his rhetoric, he lists the different goods. Mm-hmm. And if you were going to study rhetoric, his suggestion was you needed to memorize these goods, so that if you were a political leader and you're trying to persuade, you would use one of the good. And he goes into detail. This is thought to be better than this, and this is thought to be.
Doesn't it include peace in that list?
I'm not familiar with it, but I was listening to his rhetoric on an audiobook, but I was just fascinated by Aristotle, and I'm like, this guy wrote 4,000 years ago? How is this even possible? This idea that we get smarter as time passes by. I don't know. I don't know if that's true, because I know I don't know any trigonometry, and the Egyptians, it seems like they were just.
Well, Sean, it brings up a point that I've talked about with Simmons many times that he liked to revisit, is what is the actual goal of philosophy, and is it to explore new things, completely wacky and interesting, way out there things. No, it's Wittgenstein's way of thinking about the role of philosophy in our lives is to almost like scratch the itch or something like that, or to put things back.
Word games.
Bring it back to where it was before, in terms of common sense. Bring us back to common sense, and that's. So often I see Aristotle, doing that over and over and over again, and it seems like that is a really important role for philosophy. Gotta have the thought decoder. That's an important role for philosophy. Improve our thinking.
Way to tie that in. Thanks. Yeah. Well, I think this has been, and I'm not just saying this just because I've had experience with, I've known you prior, but I think this is like one of my best interviews.
Me too, Sean.
Yeah,
stuff.
Yeah, like seriously, like this is very meaty, and I feel as though someone who watches this, they're gonna come away with some knowledge, some substantial, some weighty knowledge that they can go and do further study on these ideas that were discussed today, and it's a lot here. So, thank you, audience, or whoever's watching this. When you finally see it, thank you for watching. Put your comments down in the comment section. Like and subscribe and share. If you have any questions for Dr. Wolfe for follow-up, I will send those questions to him. Make sure he gets them, and maybe we could do another video about some of those questions, or a short, or some kind of survey response. But Dr. Wolfe, thank you again, and I'm going to end it here. And remember always to think better.